November 15th, 1987. Harrison Ford had been off duty for exactly 47 minutes when the little girl grabbed his coat at Union Station. "Please pretend you're my dad," she whispered, eyes wide with terror. Two men in dark suits were pushing through the crowd toward them.
For the rest
Harrison
of his career.
didn't hesitate.
When the girl
He
opened
scooped
her
her up,
small fist,
badge ready,
she
and the men
revealed a
melted
silver
back
locket.
into the sea of commuters
Inside
like
was a
smoke.
photograph that made
Just another
Harrison's
day
blood turn to
protecting
ice.
Chicago's innocent.
His own daughter's face stared back at him. The daughter who'd been murdered 3 years ago. The girl smiled then. Not the smile of a frightened child, but something else entirely. Something that knew exactly who Harrison Ford was and why she'd been sent to find him. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The locket slipped from the girl's fingers and hit the marble floor of Union Station with a sound like a gunshot. Harrison's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, muscle memory overriding the shock that had frozen his mind. Around them, the evening rush hour crowd continued its oblivious dance, briefcases swinging, newspapers rustling, the distant echo of departure announcements bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. The child, she couldn't be more than 8, bent to retrieve the locket with movements too careful, too practiced for someone her age. When she straightened, that unnatural smile had vanished, replaced by the mask of innocent fear she'd worn moments before. But Harrison had seen behind it now, had glimpsed something that made his detective instincts scream warnings into the November air. "Who are you?" The words came out rougher than he intended. His free hand, the one not still hovering near his gun, trembled as he set the girl back on her feet. She was small for her age, with tangled brown hair and clothes that suggested she'd been traveling hard. But her eyes, Christ, her eyes held knowledge no child should possess. "I'm Sarah," she said, and the name hit him like a physical blow. His daughter's name. His Sarah, who would have been 11 now if the monster hadn't. "That's not possible." Harrison dropped to one knee, bringing himself to her eye level. The station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across her face, making her features harder to read. My daughter is dead." The girl tilted her head, studying him with the intensity of a scientist examining a specimen. "I know," she said simply. "He told me all about her. About you, about that night 3 years ago when you came home and found her bedroom window open. Found her teddy bear on the floor with its throat cut." No one knew that detail. Harrison had never put it in any report, never told his ex-wife, never whispered it to the department shrink during his mandatory sessions. The bear, Mr. Patches, Sarah's constant companion since she was 2, had been the killer's calling card, a message meant specifically for him. The image had burned itself into his retinas, stuffing scattered across Sarah's Disney princess carpet like snow, the careful precision of the cuts, the way it had been positioned so he'd see it first when he rushed into her room. "Who told you that?" His voice was barely above a whisper now. Around them, the station had grown darker as the November evening deepened. Most of the commuters were heading home to their families, to their safe suburban lives where bedroom windows stayed locked and teddy bears remained whole. Sarah, this new Sarah, this impossible Sarah, reached into her coat pocket and pulled out something that made Harrison's world tilt sideways. A small piece of yellow fabric, faded and worn, a scrap from Mr. Patch's belly. "He's been waiting," she said, pressing the fabric into Harrison's palm, "waiting for the right time, the right place. He said you'd understand when you saw this, said you'd remember what you promised." Harrison's mind raced back to that terrible night. After the crime scene techs had finished, after his ex-wife had collapsed screaming into her sister's arms, after the photographers and detectives and federal agents had finally left, he'd sat alone in Sarah's room until dawn. He'd held what remained of Mr. Patches and made a vow to the empty air, to his daughter's ghost, to whatever gods might be listening. "I'll find him. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I'll find the bastard who did this to you." "He said to tell you," the girl continued, her young voice carrying words that felt ancient and poisonous, "that he's kept his promise too. He promised Sarah, your Sarah, that he'd come back for you, that he'd finish what he started." The two men in dark suits had reappeared at the edge of Harrison's vision, no longer retreating. They stood by the information kiosk, watching, waiting, not threatening now, but patient. Like shepherds ensuring their flock didn't stray. Harrison's radio crackled to life on his belt. All units be advised, we have a missing child report. 8-year-old female, brown hair, last seen at Union Station. Child may be in the company of an unidentified male. Approach with caution. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. Here he was, off-duty cop with a kidnapped child's locket in his pocket and her fabric in his palm. Here was a girl calling herself by his dead daughter's name, speaking words only a killer could have taught her. And there were witnesses now, commuters starting to notice the intense conversation, the way the child seemed afraid of the large man crouching before her. "You have to choose," Sarah said, and for just a moment, her voice carried an echo of his real daughter's giggle. "Come with us willingly, and maybe this time, someone gets to go home safe." Harrison Ford had been a cop for 15 years. He'd worked homicide for 8 of them. He knew a trap when he walked into one. The question was whether he cared anymore. The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying cigarette. Harrison's knees ached against the cold marble, but he couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stare into those knowing eyes that belonged to a child but held the weight of something infinitely darker. 3 years since he'd knelt on different marble, the morgue floor when his legs gave out after identifying what was left of his real Sarah. 3 years since his marriage had crumbled like old paper. Since he'd moved from the house in Oak Park to a 1-bedroom apartment that smelled like other people's disappointments. 3 years of chasing leads that went nowhere, of seeing his daughter's face in every missing child report, of drinking himself to sleep with case files spread across his kitchen table like tarot cards predicting nothing but loss. The radio crackled again. "Detective Ford, please respond. Detective Ford, are you copy?" His partner's voice. Martinez, probably wondering why Harrison wasn't answering his phone, why he'd gone dark after promising to meet for dinner. Good old reliable Martinez, who still invited him to family barbecues and pretended not to notice when Harrison showed up drunk, who'd covered for him during the bad months when Harrison would disappear for days, following phantom leads to abandoned warehouses and empty lots, searching for ghosts. "They know where you live," the girl whispered, her breath visible in the station's chill. The apartment on Ashland Avenue, 3rd floor, Unit 3B. You keep her picture on the nightstand, the one from her 7th birthday where she's missing her front teeth. You talk to it sometimes, late at night when you think no one's listening. Harrison's blood turned to ice water. That photograph was the only thing he'd taken from the house, the only piece of his old life he'd allowed himself to keep. In it, Sarah was laughing at something just out of frame, probably her mother making faces behind the camera. Her gap-toothed grin was pure joy, untouched by the darkness that would find her 2 years later. He did talk to it, God help him. He talked to it every night, apologizing for not being there, for failing to protect her, for still being alive when she wasn't. The 2 men by the information kiosk had moved closer, their movements casual but deliberate. One was checking his watch like a concerned father waiting for a delayed train. The other was reading a newspaper that Harrison was certain he wasn't actually reading. Their positioning was perfect, blocking the main exit while leaving the side passages open, herding him exactly where they wanted him to go. "How long has he been watching me?" Harrison's voice sounded foreign to his own ears, hollow and defeated. "Since the beginning," Sarah said. "He chose her because of you, because of what you represented. The good cop, the loving father, the man who believed the system could protect the innocent." She reached out and touched his cheek with fingers that felt like ice. He wanted to break that. Break you, turn you into something like him. The station's PA system crackled to life. "Attention passengers, Union Station will be closing in 30 minutes. Please gather your belongings and proceed to the exits in an orderly fashion." 30 minutes. In 30 minutes, this place would be empty except for security guards and cleaning crews, except for Harrison and the girl and the 2 men who were no longer pretending to be anything other than what they were. In 30 minutes, whatever game this was, would reach its end game. Harrison thought about his apartment, about the Murphy bed that folded down from the wall and the refrigerator that contained nothing but beer and yesterday's Chinese takeout, about the stack of unsolved cases on his desk and the way his captain looked at him with a mixture of pity and professional concern, about Martinez's kids, who still asked when Uncle Harrison was coming to visit, and his ex-wife's new husband, who sent Christmas cards with careful, impersonal messages. What exactly did he have to lose? But then he looked at this child, this impossible, terrifying child who carried his daughter's name like a weapon, and saw something flicker behind the manufactured malice. A split second of genuine fear that she quickly buried, but not quickly enough. She was still just 8 years old, no matter what poison had been poured into her ears. Still someone's daughter, stolen and shaped into something she was never meant to be. The fabric of Mr. Patches felt warm in his palm now, as if it still held some trace of his real Sarah's love, as if his daughter was trying to tell him something across the void that separated the living from the dead. The radio squawked again, all units converging on Union Station. Suspect is armed and potentially dangerous. Harrison looked into the girl's eyes and made his choice. Harrison's phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. Not his radio, but his personal cell. The number only a handful of people knew. The timing felt deliberate, orchestrated, like everything else in this nightmare scenario. He pulled it out with his free hand, the other still clutching the fabric from Mr. Patches. Unknown number. The girl watched him with those ancient eyes as he answered. Ford. Hello, detective. The voice was calm, cultured, with the faint trace of an accent Harrison couldn't place. I trust you're enjoying your reunion with Sarah. Harrison's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. You son of a bitch. Language, detective. There's a child present. A soft chuckle traveled through the connection, intimate and poisonous. Though I suppose she's heard worse. Children are remarkably adaptable, aren't they? Especially when properly motivated. The girl, this Sarah who wasn't Sarah, took a step closer. Close enough that Harrison could see the careful makeup covering what looked like finger-shaped bruises on her upper arm. The sight made something primal and violent unfurl in his chest. What do you want? What I've always wanted. To finish our conversation. You remember, don't you? That night in your daughter's bedroom when you made your little promise to the darkness. I heard you, Detective Ford, every word. The station around them seemed to blur at the edges. Harrison was back in that pink and purple room, kneeling on carpet stained with his child's blood, holding the remains of a stuffed animal that had meant more to her than all the world's treasures combined. He'd thought he was alone with his grief, his rage, his desperate vow for vengeance. You were there, Harrison whispered. The words tasted like ash. I never left. Did you really think I'd taken her for money, for the usual sordid reasons? Oh, detective, your Sarah was never the prize. She was the invitation, to this moment, to this choice. Around them, the station continued its slow evacuation. The two men had moved even closer, close enough now that Harrison could see their faces clearly. One was younger, maybe 30, with the kind of bland features that would disappear in any crowd. The other was older, graying at the temples, wearing an expression of professional boredom that didn't quite reach his eyes. Neither looked like killers, which made them infinitely more dangerous. You turned her into bait, Harrison said, looking down at the girl who stood between him and whatever hell was coming. An 8-year-old child. I turned her into a message, a living, breathing reminder of what you've lost, what you failed to protect. She knows things, detective, things about your daughter's last hours that never made it into any police report. Would you like to hear them? No, but even as he said it, Harrison felt the terrible hunger for answers that had consumed him for 3 years. The need to know if Sarah had been afraid, if she'd called for him, if she'd understood what was happening to her. The girl reached up and touched his face again, and this time her fingers felt warm, human, terrifyingly real. She asked for you, she whispered, so quietly only Harrison could hear. At the end, she wanted her daddy. The phone nearly slipped from Harrison's grip. How could you possibly? Because I was there, detective. He made me watch, made me learn, told me I'd meet her father someday, and I'd need to know exactly what to say to break him. Tears started down the girl's cheeks, but her voice remained steady, practiced. She was brave, braver than I've ever been. She told him she wasn't afraid because you'd taught her that good always wins. The words hit Harrison like physical blows. He could picture it, his Sarah, his bright, fearless Sarah, facing down a monster with the absolute faith of a child who'd never learned to doubt her father's strength. Touching, isn't it? The voice on the phone continued. How children cling to their fairy tales, even at the end. But you and I know better, don't we, detective? We know that good doesn't always win. Sometimes it just dies alone in the dark, crying for help that never comes. Harrison's vision went red around the edges. 3 years of suppressed rage and guilt and self-hatred came roaring to the surface, threatening to drown whatever remained of his sanity. He thought about his service weapon, about how easy it would be to draw it, to start shooting until nothing moved. But then the girl's hand slipped into his free one, small and trusting despite everything she'd been taught to do and say. And in that contact, Harrison felt the last piece of his old life, his safe, deluded, innocent life, crumble away completely. There was no going back now, no pretending this was just another case, another missing child, another dead end in a career full of them. The killer had made it personal 3 years ago. Now Harrison was going to return the favor. Harrison closed the phone without another word, his thumb moving with deliberate precision as he ended the call that had shattered whatever remained of his carefully constructed denial. The silence that followed felt dense, oppressive, like the moment before lightning strikes. "We should go to the police," he said, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. Procedural, the kind of thing a good cop was supposed to say when faced with a situation spiraling beyond control. The girl, Sarah, this impossible Sarah, looked up at him with something that might have been pity. "You are the police," she said simply, "and they're already coming." The distant wail of sirens was growing louder now, echoing through the station's vaulted halls like the approach of some mechanical banshee. Harrison's radio crackled again, voices overlapping in urgent bursts, units in position, suspect last seen, approach with extreme caution, the language of a manhunt. For him. He could still walk away, drop the girl's hand, badge his way through the responding officers, claim he'd been trying to help a lost child, file a report about mysterious phone calls and return to his empty apartment to drink himself into unconsciousness like he had every night for the past 3 years. Pretend this was just another dead end, another cruel coincidence in a world full of them. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took for the girl to squeeze his fingers, a gesture so achingly familiar that for a moment Harrison forgot how to breathe. His real Sarah used to do that when she was scared. 3 quick pulses, like a secret code between them. "I love you." But this wasn't his Sarah, and the person who taught her that gesture had done so for reasons that made Harrison's stomach turn. "Detective Ford?" The voice came from behind him, familiar and concerned. Harrison turned to see Martinez approaching, his partner's face creased with worry and confusion. "Jesus, man, what are you doing here? We've been trying to reach you for hours." Martinez's eyes moved from Harrison to the girl and back again, taking in the scene with a detective's trained observation. Harrison watched his partner's expression shift from relief to suspicion to something approaching fear as the pieces began falling into place. "This is her, isn't it?" Martinez said quietly. "The missing girl from the Amber Alert." Harrison nodded, not trusting his voice. Martinez had been his partner for 2 years, had pulled him out of more than one self-destructive spiral, had covered for him when the brass started asking too many questions about Harrison's obsession with cold cases involving missing children. Good, solid Martinez, who had 3 kids of his own and understood what the loss of Sarah had done to Harrison's soul. But Harrison could see the moment when professional duty trumped personal loyalty. The subtle shift in Martinez's posture, the way his hand drifted toward his weapon, the careful calculation of angles and exits that every cop made instinctively when a situation went sideways. "I need you to step away from the child." Harry Martinez's voice was gentle but firm, the tone he'd use with a jumper on a bridge. "Whatever's going on here, we can work it out. But right now, I need you to let go of her hand and take 3 steps back." "You don't understand," Harrison started, but Martinez cut him off. "Then help me understand. Talk to me, partner. Tell me what's happening." The 2 men in suits had vanished. Harrison's eyes swept the station frantically, but they were nowhere to be seen. Like smoke, like shadows, like they'd never existed at all, except for the cold certainty in Harrison's gut that they were still watching, still waiting. "They're gone," the girl whispered, and Harrison heard genuine fear in her voice for the first time. Not the practiced terror she'd displayed earlier, but raw, animal panic. He doesn't like it when people interfere, when the script changes. "Who?" Martinez demanded. Who doesn't like it? But the girl had gone pale, her small body trembling. The careful composure that had seemed so unnatural in a child her age was cracking, revealing something underneath that made Harrison's protective instincts flare to life. Whatever game was being played here, whatever trap was being sprung, she was as much a victim as anyone else. Harrison's radio erupted in static, voices overlapping in urgent confusion. Suspect vehicle spotted on lower Wacker. Negative, that's not. Wait, we've lost visual. All units, we have conflicting reports. The chaos was spreading, like ripples in a pond, except the stone that had been thrown was made of carefully orchestrated confusion and misdirection. Someone was playing the system, using the machinery of law enforcement against itself. Harrison looked at Martinez, his friend, his partner, the closest thing to family he had left, and saw the exact moment when trust died in the other man's eyes. "I'm sorry," Harrison said, and meant it. Then he ran. The girl's hand slipped from his as Harrison bolted, her small fingers trailing away like the last connection to anything resembling sanity. Behind him, Martinez's voice exploded in anger and betrayal. Harry, what the hell are you?" But the words dissolved into radio chatter and shouting voices as Harrison plunged deeper into Union Station's labyrinthine corridors. He ran without direction, muscle memory from 20 years of police work, guiding him through service hallways and maintenance passages he'd forgotten he knew. The girl's footsteps pattered behind him. Somehow she'd followed. Somehow she'd kept pace despite legs that should have been too short to match his desperate sprint. When he finally stopped, gasping against a concrete wall in some forgotten utility corridor, she was there beside him, barely winded. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, and for the first time her voice sounded genuinely childlike, frightened. "He's going to be angry. The script wasn't supposed to change this fast." "Script?" Harrison's lungs burned as he tried to catch his breath. "What script?" "The one he's been writing for 3 years. She pulled something from her pocket, a small notebook, its pages filled with cramped handwriting. "He made me memorize it. Every word I was supposed to say to you. Every expression I was supposed to make. Her voice broke. "Every way I was supposed to remind you of her." Harrison took the notebook with trembling fingers. The handwriting was precise, clinical, like a medical chart documenting the systematic destruction of a human soul. Page after page of observations about his daily routines, his drinking habits, the way he talked to Sarah's photograph. Detailed psychological profiles explaining exactly how to manipulate his grief, how to weaponize his guilt. Subject responds most strongly to paternal triggers. Use diminutive gestures, hand-holding, seeking protection. Reference specific memories of his daughter to destabilize emotional defenses. Note: subject's capacity for rational decision-making decreases exponentially when confronted with child in distress. "Jesus," Harrison whispered. The notebook shook in his hands as he flipped through pages that read like a blueprint for psychological torture. How long has he been planning this? Since before she died. The girl's voice was barely audible. "He chose her because of you, because you were supposed to be the good one, the one who couldn't be corrupted." Harrison's vision blurred. 3 years of self-hatred crashed over him like a tide. Every sleepless night, every empty bottle, every case he'd neglected because he was chasing ghosts. "I failed her. I should have been there. I should have—" "You were in court." The girl's interruption was sharp, cutting through his spiral of guilt. "Testifying in the Morrison case. He knew that. He planned it that way. Made sure you'd be exactly where you couldn't help her." The Morrison case. Harrison remembered it with sickening clarity, a child abuse prosecution that had kept him in courtroom 402 until nearly 7 o'clock. He'd called home twice to check on Sarah, had promised to bring pizza for dinner. By the time he'd arrived at the house, the front door was standing open and his daughter was gone. The defense attorney, Harrison said, pieces falling into place with horrible precision. He kept delaying, asking for continuances, stretching out the testimony. "Bought and paid for." The girl nodded. "Every piece was arranged. Your wife's book club meeting that ran late. The neighbor who usually watched Sarah getting called away on a family emergency. Even the broken streetlight on your block that the city somehow never got around to fixing." Harrison's knees buckled. He slid down the concrete wall until he was sitting on the cold floor, the notebook scattered beside him. Everything he'd blamed himself for, every moment of perceived negligence, every choice that had seemed like random tragedy, had been orchestrated, manipulated. His daughter had died not because he'd failed to protect her, but because someone had spent months ensuring his failure. Why? The word came out as a broken whisper. Why her? Why me? The girl knelt beside him, her face pale in the corridor's harsh fluorescent lighting. Because you put his brother in prison 20 years ago when you were still a rookie. Do you remember? Marcus Delacroix? The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. Marcus Delacroix, a serial predator who targeted children in the Lincoln Park area. Harrison had been the one to spot the pattern, to connect seemingly unrelated disappearances. He'd testified at the trial, had watched as Delacroix received life without parole. He killed himself in Stateville, Harrison said, hung himself with bedsheets. I remember getting the call. His brother didn't see it as justice. The girl's voice carried weight far beyond her years. He saw it as murder, and he decided you needed to understand what it felt like to lose family, to have someone you love torn away from you. The corridor seemed to tilt around Harrison, walls closing in like the sides of a coffin. 20 years. This monster had nursed his hatred for 20 years, had watched and waited and planned until he could deliver the perfect revenge. Sarah's death hadn't been random violence or cruel fate. It had been the methodical execution of a madman's 20-year vendetta. And now, somehow, it still wasn't over. Harrison's entire world had just been rewritten in the span of a conversation, but as he stared at the girl's face in the fluorescent glare, another memory surfaced, one that made his blood turn to ice. What's your real name? He asked quietly. The girl hesitated, her carefully constructed mask finally slipping completely away. Emma Delacroix. The truth hit Harrison like a sledgehammer to the chest. Not just some kidnapped child used as bait, not even some random innocent caught in a madman's web. The killer's own niece. Marcus Delacroix's brother had used his own family, his own blood, to orchestrate this elaborate revenge. He's your uncle, Harrison whispered, understanding flooding through him with sickening clarity. You're not his victim. You're his weapon, Emma finished, tears streaming down her face. He's been training me since I was 5, teaching me how to lie, how to manipulate, how to become whatever someone needed me to be. She pulled up her sleeve, revealing a pattern of small, precise scars along her forearm. Every time I got the script wrong, every time I failed to be convincing enough. Harrison's vision went red around the edges. The monster hadn't just killed his daughter. He'd spent years torturing his own niece, molding a child into an instrument of psychological warfare. But as his rage crested, something else clicked into place, something that made the notebook's contents suddenly feel different. He grabbed the pages again, scanning through the meticulously detailed observations, the handwriting, the clinical precision, the intimate knowledge of his daily routines and emotional triggers. Emma, he said slowly, how long have you been watching me? Her face crumpled. 3 years. Since right after your daughter died. He made me follow you sometimes, learn your patterns, but, she looked up at him with desperate eyes. But I wasn't supposed to feel sorry for you. I wasn't supposed to care. Harrison felt the ground shift beneath him again, but this time it wasn't devastation. It was hope, a terrible, fragile hope. The notebook, these observations about my behavior, my routines. You wrote some of these, didn't you? Emma nodded miserably. He made me report everything. What time you got home, how many bottles you went through, whether you talked to her picture. I hated it, but I was so scared of what he'd do if I didn't. The handwriting changes. Harrison's finger traced across a particular passage. Here. This section about how I visit Sarah's grave every Sunday morning. The writing is different, smaller, more careful. I tried to protect you, Emma whispered, in little ways. I'd tell him you seemed stronger than you really were, or that you'd moved on more than you had. I thought maybe if he believed you weren't suffering enough, he'd leave you alone. The revelation reframed everything Harrison had read in those pages. This child, this broken, manipulated child, had been trying to shield him even while being forced to participate in her uncle's sick game. The monster's arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that his carefully crafted weapon might develop a conscience. "He doesn't know, does he?" Harrison asked. "He doesn't know you've been lying to him." Emma shook her head frantically. "If he finds out, he'll kill us both. He's already angry that the script changed, that you ran instead of playing your part. He expected you to call for backup, to handle this by the book. The chaos upstairs, that wasn't supposed to happen." Harrison's phone buzzed with an incoming text. Against his better judgment, he looked. "You disappoint me, Detective. I trained her better than this. Perhaps a demonstration of consequences is in order." Attached was a photograph that made Harrison's heart stop. Martinez, bound to a chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse, very much alive, but clearly terrified. A message written in Emma's uncle's precise handwriting was visible in the background. "Bring my niece home, Detective. We have so much more to discuss." "He has my partner," Harrison said, showing Emma the phone. Emma's face went white. No, this wasn't supposed to happen. Martinez was never supposed to be part of it. Uncle James said it would just be you and me, that no one else would get hurt if I did exactly what he told me to. Uncle James? The name felt significant, though Harrison couldn't place why. James Delacroix. He changed his last name after Marcus died, but... Emma's voice trailed off as she saw Harrison's expression change. "James Crenshaw," Harrison said slowly. "Dr. James Crenshaw, the department psychiatrist." Emma nodded, confusion clear in her eyes. "How did you—" "He's been my therapist for 2 years," Harrison whispered. "After Sarah died, when I couldn't function, when the brass ordered me to get help, they sent me to him." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with devastating clarity. Every session, every carefully guided conversation, every breakthrough and setback, all of it had been orchestrated by the man who'd killed his daughter. The very person supposedly helping him heal had been the architect of his destruction all along. "Children are remarkably adaptable," Harrison quoted softly, remembering the voice on the phone. It was a phrase Dr. Crenshaw used constantly in their sessions. The arrogance, the sheer breathtaking arrogance of it made Harrison want to scream. But Emma was looking at him with terror in her eyes, and somewhere across the city, a good man was about to die because Harrison had finally learned the truth. The game was far from over. Harrison stared at the phone screen. Martinez's terrified face burned into his retinas. Every instinct screamed at him to call for backup, to mobilize every cop in the city. But 3 years of therapy with Dr. James Crenshaw had taught him exactly how the man's mind worked and how far he'd go to maintain control. "If I bring in the cavalry, Martinez dies," Harrison said, more to himself than to Emma. "He'll kill him anyway." Emma's voice was hollow, aged beyond her 8 years. "Uncle James doesn't leave loose ends. He only took your partner to make sure you'd come alone." Harrison's hands shook as he scrolled through his phone's call history. 2 years of scheduled appointments with Dr. Crenshaw. Every Tuesday and Thursday, 3 p.m. sharp. Harrison had poured his soul out to this monster, had trusted him with every fear, every regret, every sleepless night spent staring at Sarah's empty bedroom. "The sessions," Harrison whispered, memories flooding back with sickening clarity. "He always asked about you, Sarah. What you were like, what games you played, what made you laugh." His voice broke. "I told him about the 3 squeeze code. I told him everything." Emma flinched. "He made me practice it, over and over until it felt natural, said it was the key to making you trust me." She looked up at him with haunted eyes. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I did that to you. You were trying to survive." Harrison knelt beside her, his anger redirecting toward its proper target. "None of this is your fault." But even as he said it, Harrison felt the old familiar weight settling on his chest, the crushing responsibility that had defined his life since Sarah's death. Another child in danger, another chance to fail, another opportunity for Dr. James Crenshaw to prove that Harrison Ford was exactly the broken man he'd been carefully crafted to become. His phone buzzed again. Another message, 1 hour, Detective, the old Sinclair steel plant on the south side. Come alone, bring my niece, and perhaps Detective Martinez will live to see his children again. He chose that place specifically. Emma said, reading over his shoulder. He's been planning this conversation for months. Every possible variable accounted for. What conversation? The one where he proves you're not the hero you think you are. Emma's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. He wants to give you a choice. Save Martinez or save me. See if the great detective Harrison Ford, the man who put his brother away, will sacrifice a child to save his partner. Harrison's blood turned to ice. The psychological profile in Emma's notebook suddenly made perfect sense. Every observation about his protective instincts, every note about his inability to let children come to harm. Crenshaw hadn't just been planning revenge, he'd been designing the perfect moral crucible to destroy what was left of Harrison's soul. He doesn't know, does he? Harrison said suddenly. About the lies you've been telling him, about how you've been protecting me. Emma shook her head. He thinks his weapon is perfect. That 3 years of conditioning made me completely loyal to him. Then we have an advantage. What advantage? Emma's voice cracked. He's had 3 years to prepare for this. He knows every move you'll make before you make it. No, Harrison said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he felt something other than despair. He knows every move the broken cop would make. The guilt-ridden drunk who's been drowning in self-hatred for 3 years. But he doesn't know what I'm capable of when I'm fighting for someone else. Harrison stood, decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. For 3 years, he'd been sleepwalking through his life, letting Crenshaw carefully guide him deeper into darkness. Every therapy session had been another turn of the screw, another layer of manipulation designed to keep him weak and compliant. But Emma had changed the script. This 8-year-old girl, brutalized and broken but still fighting to protect him, had thrown sand in the gears of Crenshaw's perfect machine. The monster's arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that his weapon might choose her target over her handler. I need you to do something for me, Harrison said, pulling out his backup phone, the one Crenshaw wouldn't know about. I'm going to record a message. Everything we've discovered, everything about your uncle's real identity. If this goes wrong, it won't go wrong, Emma interrupted with startling firmness. You're not the same man who lost his daughter 3 years ago. Uncle James is too proud to see it, but I've been watching you. You're stronger than he thinks. Harrison looked at this remarkable child, scarred and manipulated but somehow still capable of faith, and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Not hope exactly, but something harder and more dangerous. Purpose. Dr. James Crenshaw had spent 3 years believing he was playing chess with a broken man. It was time to show him what happened when the broken man remembered how to fight back. The game was far from over. But for the first time, Harrison wasn't playing defense. Harrison hit record on the backup phone, his voice steady despite the storm raging in his chest. This is Detective Harrison Ford, badge number 1247. If you're hearing this, it means I'm probably dead, and you need to know the truth about Dr. James Crenshaw. The words flowed out of him, 3 years of manipulation exposed. Marcus Delacroix's 20-year vendetta laid bare, Emma's forced complicity in her uncle's twisted game. When he finished, Harrison uploaded the recording to 3 different cloud services and sent copies to Internal Affairs, the FBI, and Martinez's personal email. Insurance, he told Emma, pocketing the phone. Now, tell me about the steel plant. What's he planning? Emma's face was pale but determined. There's a main floor with catwalks above. He'll put Martinez somewhere you can see him but not reach quickly, force you to choose between immediate action and careful planning. She hesitated. Uncle James believes you'll sacrifice everything to save one life. That's how he thinks good men die. He's not wrong, Harrison admitted, but he's also not seeing the whole picture. They moved through the warehouse district as shadows lengthened into evening. Harrison felt the familiar weight of his service weapon, but also something else, a clarity that had been absent for 3 years. Every case he'd worked, every life he'd saved, every moment of courage he'd forgotten in his spiral of self-destruction was coming back online. The Sinclair steel plant loomed against the darkening sky like a monument to industrial decay. Harrison counted exits, assessed sight lines, mapped the terrain with the methodical precision that had once made him one of Chicago's best detectives. Beside him, Emma moved with the unnatural quiet of a child who'd learned that survival depended on invisibility. "He'll expect us to come through the main entrance," she whispered. "There's a loading dock on the east side. The locks are broken. And you know this how? He brought me here last month. Called it a rehearsal." Emma's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. "He made me practice begging for your help while he pretended to be Martinez." Harrison's jaw clenched, but he forced his rage into focus. Emotion was a luxury he couldn't afford, not with 2 lives hanging in the balance. They slipped through the loading dock into a vast space filled with rusted machinery and shadows. Harrison's flashlight revealed catwalks 30 feet above, structural beams that could hide a dozen snipers, and in the center of it all, a pool of light where Martinez sat bound to a chair. His partner was alive but barely conscious, blood trickling from a head wound. And standing behind him, invisible in the darkness beyond the light, was a voice Harrison knew too well. "Punctual as always, Detective. Though I notice you brought my niece instead of leaving her somewhere safe. Disappointing, but not entirely unexpected." Dr. James Crenshaw stepped into the light, and Harrison felt a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with their therapy sessions. This was the face from Sarah's case file, older, more refined, but unmistakably the same man who'd been photographed outside her school 2 weeks before she disappeared. "Hello, James," Harrison said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Or do you prefer Marcus? I imagine losing a brother leaves quite an impression." Crenshaw's composed mask flickered for just a moment. "Marcus was worth 10 of you. A brilliant mind destroyed by a system too blind to understand its own hypocrisy. A brilliant mind who tortured children. Children who would have grown up to perpetuate the same cruel cycle." Crenshaw's voice carried the fervor of absolute conviction. Marcus was performing surgery on a sick society. You simply couldn't see the bigger picture. Harrison felt Emma tense beside him, and he realized this was the first time she'd heard her uncle's true philosophy laid bare. No careful manipulation, no gentle conditioning, just the raw hatred that had driven 20 years of planning. "And Sarah?" Harrison asked. "What surgery were you performing when you killed my daughter?" "Teaching you empathy," Crenshaw replied without hesitation. "You took my brother from me. I wanted you to understand that loss, to feel what I felt." His smile was cold and precise. "The irony, of course, is that your grief made you so much more interesting. The man I've been treating for 3 years is far more complex than the simple-minded detective who arrested Marcus. The casual cruelty of it, the reduction of his daughter's life to a teaching moment, nearly broke Harrison's control. But Emma's small hand found his, squeezing once, twice, 3 times, their signal, their connection, their shared understanding that this monster would not win. "You want to give me a choice," Harrison said. "Save Martinez or save Emma. Watch me sacrifice an innocent to preserve what I love." "Very good, though I suspect the calculation is more complex than you realize." Crenshaw stepped backward into the shadows. "You have 30 seconds to reach Detective Martinez before the charges I've placed blow this building apart. But Emma knows where the detonator is. She can stop it, if she's willing to kill me." Harrison's blood turned to ice as he saw the trap's true dimensions. Not just a choice between lives, but a choice between salvation and corruption. Save Martinez and watch Emma become a killer, or let everyone die to preserve a child's innocence. The countdown began, and Harrison finally understood what it meant to play chess with the devil. The countdown echoed through the steel cathedral of rust and shadows, each number a hammer blow against Harrison's chest. 29, 28, 27. But Emma wasn't looking at the detonator. She was looking at him, and in her eyes Harrison saw something that stopped his world cold. Not fear, but trust. Absolute, unshakable trust in a man who'd spent 3 years believing he was broken beyond repair. "The third option," she whispered, so quietly only he could hear. Harrison's mind raced through the geometry of the trap. Crenshaw positioned in the shadows, Martinez 30 yards away, the detonator somewhere in Emma's line of sight. But the monster's arrogance had created a blind spot. He'd spent so long orchestrating Harrison's emotional destruction that he'd forgotten the basic mathematics of tactical response. 15, 14, 13. Emma, Harrison said clearly, his voice carrying across the vast space. Do you remember what I told you about my daughter? About the games we used to play? Crenshaw's confident smile flickered. This wasn't in his script. Hide and seek, Emma replied, understanding flooding her young face. 8, 7, 6. Harrison moved. Not toward Martinez, not toward Crenshaw, but laterally into the maze of rusted machinery. Emma vanished in the opposite direction, her small form disappearing into shadows with the practiced ease of a child who'd learned that survival meant becoming invisible. The overhead lights suddenly cut out. Emma had found the electrical panel. Crenshaw's voice cracked across the darkness, the first real emotion he'd shown. This isn't how it works. You choose. You always choose. But Harrison had stopped choosing between terrible options the moment Emma squeezed his hand. Instead, he'd chosen to remember what he'd been before grief broke him, not just a detective, but one of the best. And the best didn't play by the monster's rules. The explosion never came. In the darkness, Harrison heard the soft click of the detonator being disarmed, followed by Emma's whispered voice, I found it, Harrison. It's safe. Emergency lighting flickered on, casting long shadows across the industrial wasteland. Crenshaw stood exposed in the center of the space, his careful orchestration reduced to chaos. For the first time in 3 years, he was the one without a plan. 20 years, Harrison said, emerging from the shadows with his weapon drawn. 20 years of planning undone by an 8-year-old girl who chose love over fear. She's mine, Crenshaw snarled, all pretense of psychological superiority gone. I made her. I shaped her. She belongs to me. No, Emma's voice carried across the space, small but unbreakable. I belong to myself. The federal agents who breached the building 10 minutes later found Dr. James Crenshaw sitting in shocked silence, finally understanding that his perfect psychological weapon had developed a conscience. Emma's recorded testimony, combined with Harrison's backup files and physical evidence from the steel plant, built a case that would keep the monster in prison for the rest of his natural life. But for Harrison, the real resolution came later, in the quiet hospital room where Martinez recovered from his concussion. Emma sat curled in the visitor's chair, finally looking like the child she was instead of the weapon she'd been forced to become. Child Services would find her a new family, far from the shadows of her uncle's legacy. She saved us all, Martinez said quietly, watching Emma sleep. That little girl saved us all. Harrison nodded, but his throat was too tight for words. 3 years ago, he'd failed to save his daughter. Tonight, his daughter had reached across death itself to help him save another child. The thought didn't diminish his grief. Sarah was still gone, still missed with every breath he took. But the crushing weight of failure, the certainty that he was broken beyond repair, had lifted. He pulled out his phone and deleted Dr. Crenshaw's contact information. Then he scrolled through his address book until he found what he was looking for. Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma specialist Martinez had recommended years ago, a real therapist, one who hadn't been part of his destruction. Tomorrow, he would make the call. Tomorrow, he would begin the long work of healing from 3 years of psychological manipulation. Tomorrow, he would start learning to forgive himself for failing to see through Crenshaw's elaborate deception. But tonight, he simply sat in the quiet darkness, watching over a sleeping child who'd taught him that broken things could still choose to be brave. Outside the hospital window, Chicago glittered in the distance. 8 million people living their lives, most of them unaware that a monster's 20-year game had finally ended. Harrison thought about Sarah, about Emma, about the strange mathematics of loss and redemption. He was still broken. But broken things, he'd learned, could still cast shadows long enough to shelter the innocent. That would have to be enough.